The iconic duo of Rankin and Bass are obviously most famous for their stop-motion Christmas specials released in the 1960s and 70s, charming audiences with their slightly jerky yet nonetheless completely sincere stories on the importance of the Christmas spirit. But I already got more into all of that in another video, which you can find a link in the description too. Because in actuality, their reach extended far beyond just Christmas specials, one of which I even dedicated a whole video to, which you can also find a link in the description too. But one of their more notable non-Christmas themed holiday escapades has got to be the Halloween spectacular Mad Monster Party, a full-length stop-motion movie detailing Dr. Frankenstein's struggles after deciding to retire and find somebody to succeed him as head of the Council of Monsters. And today, I'd like to go over this movie and specifically how bizarre and different it is from most of Rankin and Bass's other output. And there will be spoilers ahead, so if you'd like to check this movie out for yourself, you should probably come back to this video another day. This will be your one and only warning. Okay, so the first thing that must be mentioned about Mad Monster Party is that it might just be the strangest monster-themed crossover ever. Now, as I detailed in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too, Universal has never been any stranger to pairing up their monsters with each other, or even the likes of Abbott and Costello. But what makes this movie even weirder than anything Universal had done mainly comes down to two things. The first of which being that this movie is not connected to Universal in any way. It wasn't financed by them, Rankin and Bass weren't given permission to use their characters, nothing like that. And yet, the movie clearly goes out of its way to be an homage to classic Universal horror movies, as most of the monsters are based off of them. And they even got Boris Karloff, in one of his last roles before his death, to voice Victor Frankenstein, in a bit of meta reversal, as he was of course most famous for playing the monster, but here he instead voices the scientist who created him. But due to wanting to be as much like Universal as possible without paying royalties, the movie had to use a lot of loopholes. Like, for example, out of all the monsters that appear, only Count Dracula, the Invisible Man, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are referred to by their actual names, because they happen to be in the public domain and thus weren't owned by Universal. But the rest of the monsters had to be referred to with public domain equivalents, with the monster himself being called Fang, the Bride of Frankenstein is just called the Monster's Mate, Quasimodo is referred to as the Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Gill Man from the Creature from the Black Lagoon is known as the Creature, and the Mummy and Werewolf are simply generic variations of the characters Universal had created. And, of course, King Kong, which wasn't even released by Universal, is only referred to as It. But we'll get back to that later. So when all is said and done, this basically amounts to a movie that wants to be an ode to perhaps the most famous period in horror movie history, but has to sidestep around anything that would have made it too blatant. Not that it takes a genius to figure out what they were doing, but it still feels weird. And that's what leads right into the second thing that makes this such an odd crossover, which is that you've got so many classic horror movie monsters that famously scared the pants off of people, and unite them for what's essentially a board meeting and party with a skeleton band and zombie butler modeled after Peter Lorre called Yak. Now, sure, there is a lot of conspiring in the ranks and opportunities for the monsters to act like monsters, but it's still a very odd setup. Though what also doesn't help is that this movie makes it extremely obvious why Rankin and Bass stuck mostly to TV specials, because it feels like you could easily cut 30 to 40 minutes and you wouldn't be missing much as far as the plot goes. Because in essence, the movie begins with Victor Frankenstein discovering the formula for destroying matter, and thus decides to retire and have his straight-laced nephew take over his position as ruler of the monsters and protector of his formula. Now early on, there are some signs that many aren't too happy with this arrangement, up to and including his assistant Francesca. But after that, the plot takes quite a few detours. From the monsters and Felix showing up on the island, to the arrangements for the monsters' dinner, to the aforementioned skeleton band musical number, before it really feels like the plot starts to pick up where the beginning had left off, because it's only at about the halfway point do things start playing out the way you'd expect. Felix is hesitant to take over his uncle's position due to having no experience with monsters, while Francesca and the monsters conspire to get rid of Felix so they can have the matter-destroying formula for themselves, only for Francesca to eventually turn on them and try to save Felix from their wrath. Though, for what it's worth, the movie does have a pretty surprising ending, but I won't give it away here. Let's just say there's a reason that out of all the monsters involved, King Khan was the only one Victor Frankenstein was afraid of and only referred to him as it. But the point here is, the movie would have probably been better off as a TV special like most other Radkin and Bass productions rather than a full-fledged film. Because again, a lot of scenes feel as if they're in there simply to kill time rather than because they contribute anything to the plot. In fact, the scene with Yek in the kitchen was specifically added in after the fact because the executives thought the movie was too short, so there was definitely a lot of material that didn't need to be there. And there's also the fact that the songs are for the most part pretty lackluster. Sure, they probably would have been just fine for a TV special, but for a feature-length film, pretty much only the skeleton band number stands out. Though Victor Frankenstein's number does at least prove why Boris Karloff didn't want to sing "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch" himself, because he certainly wouldn't have been winning any Grammys. But perhaps the biggest problem with all of this is that if you come across a crossover of this nature, most are going in either expecting to see all the monsters fighting each other, or for what the title implies, classic monsters getting together for a crazy party akin to the Monster Mash. And considering the movie is over an hour and a half, it could have easily delivered on both fronts. But because it shifts its focus elsewhere for so long, there's really only one scene depicting the titular Mad Monster Party, even if it is a pretty long one all things considered, before the monsters all turn on the Doctor and Felix. But even that doesn't go on as long as it could have before it shows up and everything falls completely off the rails. In the end, it was a great idea, especially for the likes of Radkin and Bass, but it definitely stumbled in execution. But that being said, the movie does still have its good points. I mean, where else are you going to get to see so many different classic monsters in one room together, both for a jamboree and a team up for a shared goal, and have it be done by the likes of Radkin and Bass on top of that? Seriously, even if the results aren't the best, it's still a dream come true for many a horror movie fan. And on that topic, the characters are also done pretty well. All the monsters behave exactly the way you'd expect them to, and Felix is your stereotypical nerd who's in way over his head, but manages to get through it all simply by being nice, which in turn makes him very likable. And Francesca, by contrast, makes for a pretty effective femme fatale, being deadly yet surprisingly sympathetic in nature, with her change of heart being a rather believable one. And Victor Frankenstein himself is the perfect wise old mentor figure who's extremely responsible and is always a step ahead of everyone else, and Boris Karloff's reading only adds to it. Though if we're talking about voice acting here, special mention has to go to Alan Swift, as with the sole exception of the Doctor, he voices every male character in the movie. And that's no exaggeration either. If you hear a man's voice in this movie that's not Victor Frankenstein's, it's Swift's, and you would never know it. Seriously, this guy's vocal range was so impressive it would make the likes of Mel Blanc very proud. So in the end, Mad Monster Party may be a flawed addition to the classic collection of Radkin and Bass that shows exactly why they stuck mostly to TV specials, but it still isn't something they should be ashamed of either. Because if nothing else, it still has many of the hallmarks of Radkin and Bass that most know and love to this day, and even if it doesn't have as much of that classic charm as their more well-known stuff does, it is still there to an extent. Again, it's by no means perfect, and perhaps a lot weirder than they had intended, but most fans of classic Universal horror will probably see it as a harmless parody and ode to the golden age of horror, especially due to the involvement of the legendary Boris Karloff. But as far as general audiences go, it's probably better off being lost to time, as people can be notoriously hard on films like this. Because while it definitely has its problems, there's no doubt about that. For what it is, it works with intolerances, and has even developed a cult following. Though when you've got a weird movie about a bunch of monsters having a party and teaming up to kill a scientist and his nephew, would you really expect anything different? As I just said, it's acceptable for what it is, but overall it's definitely not among the best stuff to ever come out of the likes of Radkin and Bass. The weirdest? Most definitely, but nowhere near the best. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. So now let me hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Mad Monster Party was a good idea in theory, but in execution wasn't really able to deliver on the potential of its premise? Or do you believe it's one of the greatest horror movie crossovers of all time, and the most underrated thing to ever come out of Radkin and Bass? Or had you simply never heard of it before you clicked on this video? Whatever the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments below, because you don't have to agree with anything I said in this video if you don't want to. You are absolutely entitled to your own opinion, and if you love a Mad Monster Party and think it's perfectly made, that is totally fine, and I have no issue with you for thinking that way. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.